Arcane Backgrounds is normally the place where I will really hook in my reticent D&Ders and Pathfinder players. Because once you see or at least understand how the system of being a spellcaster, and we'll say wizard for easier terms, and cleric, druid doesn't really matter, works in Savage Worlds, it's really where those kind of people really fall in love with the system. So first, let's talk about Arcane Background. We'll talk about the versatility of this. It's going to feel generic, and it's by design. Everything is given a name based on what it does. A bolt is a bolt of magical energy. So it's not a magic missile, it's not an acid arrow, it's none of that, but it can be that with your trappings, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. But the versatility is such as, like, I use Arcane Background miracles. Okay, cool. Well, how does that work out? Obviously, they're granted to you, but that's where you come into it. And we'll get into that when we start talking about the different backgrounds and how it plays out. But Savage Worlds requires a lot of input from you, but it's not work. It's because you get a chance to finally do what the hell you want to do instead of asking Mother May I all the time. So versatility is important. The power edges, this is where they can come into play here when you start looking at some of the power requirements, because Savage Worlds uses PowerPoints. We'll get into that. And so you understand when those edges come into it. Every arcane background requires an arcane skill. Normally it's going to be spellcasting. For magic, it's going to be faith for miracles, focus for superpowers, and what does it get? Superpowers. Sorry, and then psionics for psionics. And then Weird Sciences also has a Weird Science skill. And we'll cover kind of what these are. And this is going to be a little bit... This will only be a single topic video because of this. Now, every arcane background has a list of starting powers that are applicable to you. They also have a number of powers. So sometimes not every power is applicable, and the GMs are more than free. If you're trying to emulate Dungeons & Dragons, they're probably going to remove healing from the magic background. But by default, a Savage Worlds wizard can cast healing. You don't have to divide yourself. You're just a spellcaster, and all the powers are arrayed before you for your choosing. Every power also has a rank, just like your edges. So you're not going to start casting every power. They're going to have novice powers, seasoned powers, heroic, veteran, and you got to meet those. And it just is what it is. But there's the funnel starts very wide for the novice level powers, and they start to go in. But you're not also limited just kind of how the powers fun. They're not just very base and well and written down as this just as one thing. We'll get into that too. Every arcane background also includes a number of power points that you start with. Now, power points is how Savage Worlds by default uses its magic system. A bolt power is one power point to cast it. So if you start with, say, 10 power points because you're arcane background magic, that's 10 bolts, and you can throw these things willy-nilly and just go crazy with them. And they're going to do what they do. Some, and not all arcane backgrounds are created equal when it comes to the number of power points that they start with. Some have more, some have less. Those are the big ones for the arcane backgrounds I can really think of. I'm trying to make sure I'm covering some of the basics of what to expect when you look at arcane background. Trappings. Let's talk about trappings. So trappings is Savage Worlds' way of letting your bolt power stand apart from the person next to you's bolt power. And trappings are 100% on you. They can give you some ideas. You can look at your favorite spells from other games and say this is what it looks like, and that's awesome. The example I always use is if you have a person using arcane background magic, their bolt may look like a magic missile out of D&D or a chromatic orb or whatever you want to use. And the druid has a thing and whatever you got going on. I played a druid in Savage Worlds, and my bolt power, which remember it's just an arcane energy coming out and striking your target and dealing damage. It doesn't auto hit. You're rolling. Well, it auto hits, but you still have to roll your arcane skill when you're using your powers. So that's your point of failure. But when the druid used bolt, the druid distended his jaw, and a small puff of wasps flew out. And that was the bolt power taking effect. And when the wasp began stinging, that was the swarm of wasps hitting the target and dealing the damage, and then they would dissipate. And so that's how creative you can get in Savage Worlds. And it's highly encouraged that you do. You also are highly encouraged to name your power. So you shouldn't just have your character sheet say, "Oh, I have Bolt." Your character sheet could say like, "Well, I have, Swarm of Hornets," and parentheses Bolt. But you're naming your stuff. You can name it after gods. You can name it after powers you've seen or spells you've seen in other games. It really doesn't matter, but you want to be as creative as possible. Trappings normally don't have a mechanical effect, but they can have effects with some synergy. If, say, you have said that your bolt is a firebolt and you encounter a creature susceptible to fire, a GM can rule that there is going to be an increased effect. You cannot change your trappings. There is a way of doing it, but not normally. Once you select a trapping for your power, that is it. If you wanted to have it like from a firebolt and an ice bolt, you'd essentially be getting bolt a second time. But there is an edge. There's a way, or there is some clever ways of changing your trappings. But it's going to cost you an advancement to do so if it's really that important to you. Or an edge, I should say. So that's the big one on trappings. They're super important, and they don't sound important because there's nothing mechanical to them, but they're important because they let you push your vision of the universe onto the narrative and have a really good time doing it instead of just, I cast magic missile again. No one cares, right? But when you start summoning swarms of wasps out of your mouth, that's pretty dope, no matter how many times you do it. Especially if your descriptions get really good. Activation. Every power is going to require activation. You make your arcane skill roll. A 4 or better activates. Many powers have, if you get a raise, so if you get an 8, then something extra happens or something better happens. And then some might have penalties. Some there might be opposed rolls sometimes. So if you're going at a target, they may oppose your arcane skill roll by their, normally it's spirit is the common one that you're going to see in the book. Again, where spirit becomes very important and not a dump stat like many people believe. But that's how activation works. If you fail the activation, no harm, no foul. However, if you roll double ones, so it's a 1 on your arcane skill die and a 1 on your wild die, that is called a critical failure. And hopefully you are playing with dynamic backlash, which is a setting rule, but critical failures can be very bad and they can drain your power points. You can do a lot of things. Dynamic backlash can actually start injuring you or those around you if it's played right. Highly advised dynamic backlash. It makes magic thrillingly dangerous because you're not going to roll the critical fails often, but when you do, man, do they get fun. And you can't bend your way out of a critical fail by default. So in addition to the activation of just a skill roll, you can't be bound and you have to be able to see your target. Should be fairly familiar with most people playing most games. Every power is going to have a duration. If you want to increase that duration by basically, if you have like your entangle is a duration of 5 and you want to keep it going, essentially you're going to maintain it for 1 power point for another 5 rounds. It's very cheap, but you're still sacrificing power points. You gain power points back at a rate of 5 power points for every hour that you're not doing anything. You can walk, you can travel, but you can't do anything arduous. You don't have to sleep or meditate. You just can't get in combat and you can't do things like that. But you'll get back your 5 power points. You can also spend a penny to get back 5 power points immediately. That becomes very handy and very tempting for spellcasting characters. Powers can be used as a multi-action, and this is where I get a lot of people. I know the Pathfinder 2 folks will say that they now have multi-action. Congratulations, welcome to 2004, since Savage Worlds has always had multi-actions. But in this, if you could do 3 actions per round, and they can be the same action, so you could bolt, and you could cast bolt, blast, burst, puppet, which is essentially a mind control spell, bolts. There's any powers you can use up to 3 powers, same power, whatever. You can do multi-actions. Of course, there's a penalty associated with it, so it become a little more increasingly difficult to take the multiple actions, but you have the option of doing it. You can also short a power. So say you're running low on power points and you really need to cast that power. If you don't meet the PowerPoint requirements, for every PowerPoint you lack, you can take a -1 to the arcane skill roll. So if your power requires 4 points and you only have 2 left, you can take a -2 to the roll, burn through your last power points, and then go ahead and cast it out. However, if you do roll a failure on that, then there are consequences for that, and you're going to start getting fatigued, and that can actually knock you out from doing it. So shorting, power modifiers. Now, there's a general set of power modifiers. So if you want to be selective on your power, so it's like, well, my blast power, which is like, explosion going off, fireball. But in Savage Worlds, it's going to affect everything in your template, in your burst template. But you can spend an extra power point or 2 power points and say, well, it only affects enemies, not my allies. You can turn it into a heavy weapon, so you can affect heavy armor. So like if you're playing in an urban setting, your bolt spell, you add 2 power points to it, and now it's a heavy weapon, so now I can blow through tanks. Things like that. There's a whole series of those. It's not like a gigantic list, but it's enough for if you're playing a spellcaster, you want to have those on hand because you want to be able to make those adjustments on the fly, and that's where you can start blowing through your power points. Mostly is altering how you use your powers. Every power will have its own individualized power modifiers. So like bolt's an easy example because it's one most people can really grasp immediately. If your bolt does 2d6 worth of damage, but let's say you want to spend an extra power point and now it does 3d6 of damage. So pretty cool. And every power will have that. And then they also have some power modifiers that require you to have certain advanced edges, like higher ranked edges, in order to use those power modifiers. And it's when you start getting really, really fun stuff. Arcane devices. Now you can make magic items on the fly in Savage Worlds if you have an arcane background and you have the Artificer edge, and they allow you to use your power and slam it together and say, I put smite on this sword, and smite lets you deal extra damage. You put smite on the sword and you hand that sword to the group fighter instead of just saying, hey, I'm going to cast smite, and then he has the sword. Your power points are spent for a time. You recharge them so you can get them back, but the power points you invest in the sword, let's say it's 5, they stay on that weapon, and then it gets used. It then gets used at their fighting or shooting. Some of them may use your arcane skill. It really depends. You really have to kind of get into the section and understand what's going on. But you see this mostly in weird science where they're making weird contraptions, but there's nothing stopping you from making an arcane device and being able to get those out to people. And then let them have fun. And then there's the section is a little more in depth, but just know that it can be done. Naming powers we talked about. It's very important that you name your powers. You do something with them that makes them special to your character or to the world setting. Super handy. Now, the arcane backgrounds that we have. Gift. Arcane background, gift. That is basically superheroes. Arcane background, magic. Wizards, arcane people. Arcane background, miracles, your divine casters. Arcane background, psionics, self-explanatory. And arcane background, weird science. This is your like pulp stuff, like the Wild Wild West movie, where they're, I've got old man Jenkins, slit grease, and it just happens to, be this grease you can wipe on something and it heals it. So things like that. That's all it really is. And those are the trappings of weird science. And weird science is it's really fun. But you normally see that in, like we use it in Eberron for artificers. But you'll see it in, more of the pulpy Weird West kind of games, or like weird sciencey pulp 30s with Nazi weird science magic and things like that. And that is the biggest one for the powers. And when you read through them, it feels like there's not a lot. And you're like, well, everyone has a bolt power. Yeah, they do, but not everyone is going to do the same thing with a bolt power. Not everyone will see the bolt power the same way. And it becomes really important when you're going to this and you start playing off of one another in a group, and you realize, oh man, we can do really link up our abilities and have a really formidable wedge of arcane skill use in the game. And that is it.